Hello and welcome to this discussion on the Ukraine conflict and lessons for India's national security. My name is Samir Patil. It has been more than 1.5 months since the Russian invasion, or what Moscow terms as special military operation in Ukraine. While initially the Russian forces made quick advances in the country, few weeks down the line, their speed has slowed down and they have been unable to capture the capital, Kiev, much against the expectations of both Russian military leaders as well as non-Russian defense experts. In recent days, Russians have concentrated on eastern part of Ukraine, bombarding the cities there with missiles and shelling. The West, meanwhile, has refused to get drawn into this conflict, fearing escalation. Russian President Vladimir Putin has even put his nuclear forces on special alert. US has responded by imposing series of sanctions aimed to cripple the Russian economy, particularly its defense, energy, and tech sectors. Also seen in this conflict are the elements of cyber warfare and disinformation, which continue to play a crucial role in aiding and abetting Russian conventional military operations. Ukraine too has kept at the propaganda game, beaming worldwide images of Ukrainian resistance against the Russian military and Ukrainian president addressing every important gathering and national parliaments. The US meanwhile fears that Russia may be exploring cyber attacks on the West in response to the sanctions. So, as the first major interstate conflict of the 21st century, how does the Ukraine conflict affect India? What are its national security implications? What are the lessons for our own defense preparedness? What does it mean for India's security and defense partnerships? To discuss these and other questions, we have today a stellar panel of speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Shalini Chavla. She's a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies, and she's also a visiting faculty at the Naval War College in Goa. Air Marshal Diptendu Choudhury, former commandant of the National Defence College. He is an extremely experienced pilot and has flown over 5,000 sorties on all frontline fighters of the Indian Air Force. And Dr. V. Yoga Josna, honorary adjunct fellow at the National Maritime Foundation. She has also served as Dean of Social Sciences at Usmania University in Hyderabad and also as head of the Amity Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies. Thank you all for agreeing to participate in today's discussion. So let me first begin with you, Dr. Chawla. Ma'am, how do you view the conflict in Ukraine affecting India's national interest and security? Ma'am, you're on mute.
Okay. Now, am I audible now? Yeah. Thank you. I would begin by thanking ORF for inviting me for this crucial discussion, and thank you, Samir. We have all seen that how India is balancing its security and strategic interests, managing its relationship between the two powers, and very importantly, its position on the global platform as the Russia Ukraine war has progressed. Now, however, any diplomatic standing cannot counter the fact that India will not face challenging emanating from this war. While there will be challenges in the longer run or even now, but what we are seeing, there are critical lessons for India. And if talking about the major lessons for India, I have 7 points. My first point is that there have been two major crises that the world saw in the last 8 months. One in our region in Afghanistan, takeover of the Taliban with massive bloodshed and blatant disregard for human rights, which is still going on. And second is Russia-Ukraine war, where obviously the scale is much different, the objectives are different. But the crisis clearly tells us that your conflicts and disputes, and specifically the military conflicts, are your own. Any military measure, if you may say, has to bear this factor in mind from India. We can fetch diplomatic support, punitive actions against India's adversaries in the form of sanctions, isolation, but war fighting remains your own responsibility. And more importantly, the impact of the war is solely yours. India has experienced military tensions on its borders with Pakistan and China. So, in case of a probable war, and this I would say is not a lesson but more of a reaffirmation for Delhi, it completely India's own capability that it has to rely on, because no other country actually has an appetite for a conventional war, and that's something which we have seen in the crisis. So, strengthening your own diplomatic and strategic posture, And having a deep understanding of the strategic posture of your partners and adversaries is critical in crucial decision making. My second point is that India needs to be proactive in building a credible deterrence. We have an experience of war fighting and living with hostilities on our borders for more than 7 decades. Our conventional capability has deterred Pakistan. We have seen it in the past. But certainly, India needs to be proactive in building credible deterrence because deterrence would also assist our strategic objectives. And deterrence can be built on two factors. One is building our own defense capability. So certainly increase in our defense budget, a regular, consistent, increasing flow. Our present GDP expenditure on defense is, I would say, very low, and we spend 2.1% of the GDP on defense. So I feel this needs to scale up. And second is our posturing, our strategic signaling. So, a balance between strategic restraint and assured military response to your adversary's moves has to be calibrated. Clear defined lines have to be there. Like for our adversary, we defined that we won't allow terror on our land and we will not allow alteration of our territorial boundaries. So we have seen this in the case of Pakistan and China. So strategic signaling is a very critical part. Um, Third, a strong military can only be made if there is a strong economy. So, a strong military without its economic base will not be able to hold a nation in its sovereign decision. So, definitely, economically, we are moving towards Atmanirbharta, but an Atmanirbharta has to grow in the field of technology, energy for economy to have a sustained growth. Like we see in the case of Pakistan, where the military is very strong, it has modernized itself significantly with the Chinese assistance, American equipment, which came in 1980s after 9/11. But an aid-dependent economy, because it's vulnerable and it has not allowed Pakistan to be truly independent in decision making. So the parallel growth needs to go. My fourth point is on information warfare. And we have seen how information warfare has been a critical part of the current crisis. We have seen how the narratives work in the strategic domain and cater to nations' interest. Now, Western narratives have dominated the scenario and this crisis. And lessons for India is that a narrative building is crucial part of our strategy. This is the area where India needs to put more efforts. We are working towards it, but a sustained and calculated efforts towards building narrative based on facts is required. And related to that, I would want to make one more point that we have a very significant dependence on Russian military equipment. And now what we will see that more and more in the coming time after this crisis is over, there will be series of, it's already happening, but there will be increasing, numbers and series of analysis from West and NATO countries and the US providing us negative narrative of the Russian military equipment. So now in the ongoing conflict, Russia has not been able to achieve its objectives. Ukrainians are standing with their head high, continuing to fight. So the narrative that Moscow's equipment, the quality questions on that, and how that it could not even fight a weaker nations will be there. Now, for what we have to see is that how do we manage and balance the impact of this narrative on the perception building build up regarding our defense capability, which has a significant percentage of the Russian equipment. How will this narrative now impact the posturing of China and, for that matter, Pakistani thinking? So that's something which is a lesson and it's a concern. We need to think about it. Fifth is obviously diversification of our military acquisition and trade is crucial while self-dependence is an answer. So certainly India needs to continue to diversify the trade volume with more countries and maybe, thought about facilitating free trade agreements in the defense space need to be explored more. Fifth is actually a concern more than a lesson, and it's a foreseeable development that India needs to think and plan ahead. And this is about the prospect of closer Sino Russian ties after the Ukraine crisis. Moscow, as we are seeing now, its position, it's feeling very obliged towards Beijing, and there obviously there is going to be international isolation. It's already happening, sanctions, and this could be problematic for Delhi if Russia's dependence on China increases. then what are the chances of, I mean, if can China actually pressurize Russia during the time of crisis, and how can that play out? So this is one of the scenarios which India needs to think about, because Russia's dependence on China has increasingly gone up with the Western sanctions after 2014, and then now what's happening. And even the China's trade and share in Russia's trade has increased significantly from 11% in 2013 to about, say, 15.7 in 2019. So this is one factor. Even though there has been a debate that Russia and India share a very different relationship, and India is the largest export destination for Russian arms, so there will be always that special connect there. But then I think, relationship and the strategic posturing changes with the changed scenario, so we need to keep that in mind. And seventh, and my last point, is about the threat of use of nuclear weapons, which we saw here, and Russia's position on nuclear weapons and its statement that it issued regarding the threat of a probable use of nuclear weapons to deter US and NATO from direct military intervention, or for that matter assistance to US. That's not surprising given the first use doctrine that Russia has, and then the doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. But what it did was certainly alarming, and what was more surprising, that it did it within the first week of the conflict, the fourth day. So Russia did try to use the nuclear threat as shield to continue military operations. And then this was kind of surprising, because we in South Asia is referred as the nuclear, South Asia is referred as a nuclear flashpoint by the West. And we have seen this situation repeatedly with Pakistan, where Pakistan has been using this nuclear weapon threat as a weapon of blackmail and a shield to conduct its subconventional war for more than 30 years. And there have been examples of Pakistan using the threat in the time of crisis, like General Musharraf did it during Kargil. And even in the recent time, after revocation of Article 370, Imran Khan talked about the high probability of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan multiple times. Now, this is dangerous and setting up an example of nuclear behavior which is not right. So this is alarming, and we will see more of that behavior, and what needs to be done about that has to be thought out. On the other hand, South Asia, as I said, a region of nuclear flashpoint, rather has a few lessons to offer to the so-called mature nuclear nations. We saw the whole episode of Russian strike around the Ukrainian nuclear power plant, and a kind of fear that it generated with high risk of nuclear catastrophe. So in Pakistan and India have been exchanging the details of their civilian nuclear facilities every year on January 1st. We also have an agreement not to attack each other's nuclear facilities. So this could potentially serve as an example for the other nuclear state that the nuclear energy options cannot be weaponized. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chawla, for giving us really that comprehensive overview of the implications of the Ukraine conflict for India's national security. Before I turn to Air Marshal Choudhury, I also want to welcome at this point Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, who has just joined us from his busy schedule. General Narasimhan is the Director General of the Center for Contemporary China Studies. He is also a member of India's National Security Advisory Board. General, thank you very much for joining us today. I will come to you in a few minutes. But Air Marshal Choudhury, sir, there has been a lot of discussion amongst the military planners about the role of Russian Air Force in the Ukraine conflict. In fact, before the invasion began, it was widely anticipated that Russia will actually quickly achieve air superiority. What is your view on the use of air power here? Has it been optimally used by the Russians? And what does it mean about the role of air capabilities in modern conflict? You're on mute, sir. Sir, you're on mute. Sir, you're on mute. You're on mute, sir. I can't hear you.
Okay,
Yes, yes, you are. You are.
okay, great. So, sorry for that little bit of technical glitch. Uh, a lot of that has been happening in the Russia-Ukraine front, but let's not take it from there. I do have a lot of area to cover simply because of the fact that I am grateful that ORF has given me this opportunity to air some views on air power, something which has been missing from what most of the Western analysts have been saying. And as Dr. Chawla also alluded to the fact that there's a lot of perception building and a lot of other information warfare going on, which is giving a contrary image. Now, this war has brought out some very serious lessons and at all constituents and levels of probably comprehensive national power. I mean, there are takeaways for each element. And there are huge lessons for India, which have been aptly elucidated right at the beginning. I'll share some of my air power related operational and strategic analysis at the military and structural levels. Now, I have a lot of ground to cover. And since it's a topic which I think not there in the common domain. I'll probably request a little more attentive patience of the listeners because there are a lot of little points, and I'll narrow them down and try and build it up to a cohesive story. Now, Russia has still failed to establish air superiority and is suffering huge aircraft losses as a result. And a lot of these losses happen to the surface-to-air guided weapons, especially of the man-portable kinds, and a lot of contribution by Stingers and Western supplied weapons. Uh, Russia has surprisingly not made elimination of mobile SAMs a priority, nor has it pressed for the complete destruction of the Ukrainian fighter aircraft right at the beginning of the conflict. Now, this had led to a whole lot of telescoping challenges. And thereafter, it persisted in its initial days with ground attack tactics, which were not modified to the manpad which was proliferating in that area, and which put the Russian aircraft within the lethal envelope. And this had taken its own toll. So essentially, if you take all these factors together, have prevented Russia, the VKS, from establishing air superiority, and from there, and consequently, thereby leading to their inability to fully support their surface operations. Now, there was a lot of talk in between where has the Russian Air Force gone, but actually they've been flying quite a bit. And after 3 weeks of war, there's a sudden upscale in their operations, and they're averaging the max up to 300 plus sorties, and it has been petering up and down. But contrary to the other side, the PSU, the Ukrainian Air Force, has been able to fly very little. Now, Russia has executed air-launched cruise missile attacks on extended strategic basis. In fact, it's used this for strategic signaling as well when they attacked the NATO, the base where the NATO training was going on for the Ukrainian forces. So the Yarovev strike demonstrated Russia's ability to hit targets in the far-fetching corners of Ukraine. But here there's a caveat which I'll come to later. Essentially, just having this capability doesn't mean you have unended resources for carrying it out. Russia has almost currently no capability to successfully interdict supplies coming into the Ukraine through the western border in Poland. And despite its initial rhetoric, it really doesn't have any capability. The VKS or the VVS, VKS is the Russian Aerospace Forces, whereas the Russian Air Force element has shown absolutely almost no ability to find, identify, and destroy mobile targets, including the mobile SAM systems. And this is an indirect, I mean, I know it directly reflects the Russia's ability to carry out time-sensitive and mobile targeting, something which Indian Air Force today has sort of adapted to and uses it in its operational repertoire. Now, it is unlikely that even if they carry out a dedicated airstrike, they will be unable to hit supply convoys with an air attack. And this has a counter problem because if you fire missiles from hundreds of miles away, they would not be able to hit mobile targets. So therein lies the challenge. So effectively, the Russian Air Force has practically no ability to prevent mobile resupply. And its inability to coordinate, air support with the ground movements, which is there's been an absolute probably failure, has led to properly planning, resupplying of food, fuel, ammunition, which is a must for surface operations and that has affected hugely. Do remember, we're talking about large distances compared to the border construct which we have. Ours has terrain problems. In Russia, it's a problem of distances today, and an altogether seasonal challenge, which is also factored into the terrain issue. Now, Ukraine's ability to deny Russian air superiority has been probably the most successful part of their operations. The Ukrainian Air Force is still operating, albeit they don't have any ability to carry out interceptions, but they're carrying out visual interceptions and using the fighter radar, though it's an ineffective and inefficient way to conduct. But given the large number of force ratio they're facing, which goes up to almost 1:10 at times, they are having huge problems on this. But given the losses from the Russian Air Force to man-pad systems, Russia is preferring to carry out its long-distance standoff strikes with air-launched long-distance weapons with its bombers and fighters from Russian territory outside the Ukrainian AD envelope. And there are also notions of and views saying that the Russia is running out of PGMs and long distance and specialist weapons. But we have seen introduction of newer kinds of weapon systems. So one does have to keep in mind that Russia will not obviously like to expend all its weapons out in this conflict itself. Should this escalate to something bigger? Ukraine, whereas on the other hand, has successfully used this manpads supplied by the West. It is now hankering for fighters. But unlike weapons like anti-tank systems and surface-to-air weapons and other weapons, training on fighter aircraft is a very difficult proposition while a conflict is underway. Plus, there's a huge issue of familiarity of the platforms. You can't teach even a well-experienced fighter pilot into a brand new platform overnight. It takes months. So when the initial thrust of the Russian Air Force probably failed, and the Ukrainian air defense bought itself valuable time. But one bottom line I would like to end with from this, from a sort of this operational recap, is that at the end of the day, it's about resources. And Ukraine will rapidly at some point run out of platforms, experienced pilots, fatigue is setting in, they're going to run out of type-specific weapons. Whereas the Russian side is obviously conserving its hand. Now, Russia had planned this pretty well. It had carried out pre-positioned 300 odd aircraft in the vicinity well before. It had carried out opening round with 300 missile strikes. But there was a loss of tempo. And but what it did achieve was blind the Ukrainian Air Force in terms of AD and early warning systems. But it did not knock out the Ukrainian air fighter fleet or completely finish is what we call the SIED, suppression of enemy air defense. That is, it did not write off its Ukrainian air defense to its challenge, which is facing now a huge amount. Now, there was a whole lot of talk about the fighter aircraft, high-end fighter aircraft being kept away. But yes, it did its opening rounds. There was probably strategic miscalculation, but there's a huge amount of other challenges which came away. Is the fact that there was a huge problem in Army and air defense and the Air Force coordination. I'll delve on that a little later. So what is the main lesson which has emerged from this part of the analysis is that controlling the skies has yet again proved salient in conventional war, and it will indeed play a vital role in all future conflicts. So therefore, it must be made integral to all military strategy. There are some more discussions on this on the Indian context. We can do that later. So what are the key warfighting lessons from the Indian perspective? Firstly, the centrality of control of air to the military strategy. This is something which we need to bear in mind because our adversaries have strong air forces. We're not talking about near-peer air forces. We are talking about peer and probably a near-peer and a stronger air force. So this is something which we have to bear in mind, and all our operations on any domain will be in contested battle spaces. So this is something which we have to bear in mind, and we must include this into our overall military strategy, that the control of air. Poor coordination between the Air Force and the Army units, despite VVS being under the Russian Theatre Command, and the lack of air defense integration between the two services. This is some more lessons, I think, which will need closer look once all the chaff has been put aside and we get more reliable inputs and more honest analysis from both sides. Uh, Theater command employment in a classic theater command, what should I say, terrain and an environment, we'll need to look at it closer and how does it affect our approach to theater commands. Then comes the issue of vulnerability of helicopters to manpads. This is something, a lesson we keep relearning. Russia surprisingly had learned this lesson the very hard way in the entire Afghan conflict. The Americans learned it when they employed the attack helicopters in mass in the Gulf War, and at some point, in fact, the whole formation of 30 aircraft came back, except for one aircraft, all with damages. So there are huge lessons here. Airborne assault in contested airspace is not an operational viability. This is something the Air Force has been talking about for quite some time. It's possible in benign airspaces or in a created environment, which are the very small operating window, where you can dominate the airspace to push this through. But by then, you will appreciate your element of surprise would have gone. So this is something which we need to assess. How do we factor it into our military strategy? The vital role of Air Force in high-value targeting of larger strategic outcomes. Now, this is something which we must bear in mind, because after the last war of 71, where the Air Force was used in an absolutely, Indian Air Force was used without any holds barred, there was a whole lot of strategic targeting and interdiction, which I'm afraid has been lost in our somewhat Eastern-focused analysis of our war, of the 71 war. But we get into the real nitty-gritties of it. It had huge strategic outcomes, this interdiction role, and this is something which will play out very importantly for us in both our adversarial domains. And it underscores the fact that the Russian inability to do it effectively, what a difference it has made to its surface war. The importance of ISR, I cannot underscore this any more or any less. It remains an imperative, and what comes out hugely in our context, that we must have persistent stare. For that, we need space-based ISR and a persistent stare over battle spaces, whatever be the domain. Importance of integrated air defense system and the ability of India's extended Air Force's extended integrated air defense system, which we can project air defense capability offensively, is a new thought. It's not really a new thought. Air Force has been there, but finds enormous applications, and there are lessons in this conflict itself. Terrain challenges can make surface movements highly vulnerable. This has come out very loud and clear. Here again, the classic example of how the season not being to your choice can make a difference. And the fact is today, what we must take away from this is obviously the terrain will be a challenge. Season will be contested in future, where you will not have the choice of the season to start your war. It may not be in your control at all. So air interdiction again becomes a key factor in disrupting logistics, like it was done both in the Eastern Front, when the air power was able to, when the enormous amount of original thrust and brilliant action by the army had pushed through and sort of broken the logistical back of the Pakistani army. When the resupply restarted from the riverine network, the air interdiction effectively put an end to that. So what are the military lessons in a broader picture from a national perspective? Now here I'll make some statements which I'm sure might find a lot of pushback and heated discussion. I'm happy for that. I'd say my statement is a surface-centric legacy approach to national security is something which we have. This is something which has led to us dividing the security scenario between the continental and the maritime domains. Actually, it narrows down a nation's security options. And it limits a multi-domain threat appreciation, and thereby limits a nation's strategic response matrix. When you just limit it to any specific or a collection of two specific domains. Next statement is recent absence of air domain or the third dimension in India's national security narratives is deeply concerning. This I hope it is just a sort of what should I say? Something which is there in my mind, but more I read around in the recent context from the security perspectives, it is a little concerning how we have focused our security outlook to purely the continental and the maritime domain, and even those we are looking at separately. This is, I think, a strategic mistake on our part. we must remember that it is not pushing the Air Force agenda. I would like to make this very clear. I'm purely talking from a larger national security perspective when I say air pervades all domains, and just because it is invisible, it has a serious salience to national security, and that must be borne in mind. And comprehensive application of air power is critical in all future conflicts and wars. It's an international given. It's time we looked at it too like that. Uh, Efficacy of theater command in a dynamic conventional war. Important lessons will emerge. We must adapt these lessons into our narrative and our structure, a planned structure for the future. Each service fights differently all over the world, and command of other service assets have always proved a challenge historically, and it has done so in this war itself. But on the other hand, joint planning and close coordination, however, have almost always been much more successful. Uh, Air power provides invaluable capability to deterrence and coercive deterrence. This is something which Dr. Chawla alluded to. She mentioned about the need to build our deterrence. And I think going by some of the thoughts, and I know General Narasimhan is here. When he I think is a proud, is a loud proponent of coercive building to a level of coercive deterrence, and that is what air power will play a very significant role in that. It must be included in the domain. No one is saying today that air power is the only means. I mean, that is a legacy thought, but it is an important element. Then, so the bottom line I'm trying to say is service-specific domain centricity must give to a multi-domain, multi-service joint approach. And the last word which I want to put down before I move on to structural thoughts, I may be exceeding the time a little bit, but like I said, air power rarely gets air time. Technology comes at a cost. Now you find technology is a very sexy word. Everybody wants everybody wants technology. All the services, every aspect of CMP wants technology, but it comes at a cost. It takes huge developmental costs, research costs, and unfortunately, by the time it comes online, there are already counters. So it's already dated by the time it's inducted operationally. So my only request is that our budgets being what they are, the needs being what they far outstrip our budgets. We have to be hugely conscious as to what do we adopt for our technology, and that must be towards a comprehensive military capability flowing out of a comprehensive military strategy rather than pure service-specific needs or gap fillers or requirements or even aspirations. Some larger thoughts from the Indian security perspective. Use of force in national interest. I think this is something which we really need to debate, talk much more, and research on. Conventional war has had a resurgence. We keep talking about limited, short, swift wars. Will they be limited? Will they be short and swift? Do we have the handle on the end state to be able to terminate the war, at least at our calling? If it's not going to your way, gray zone has become a part of a regular repertoire of warfare. So there is a need for us to review the role of force in the nation's strategy. Terrain will remain a challenge. I mentioned this earlier, and the choice of season may no longer be an option. Precepts of mass and maneuver need a revisit and a review. In an overwhelming force, is that what we have actually always followed in our military precepts? Is that the only option for the military instrument, overwhelming force? This is something we need to relook at carefully, because today we find and it's a classic example of how the Ukrainians have responded. Swift, agile, stealthy, flat teams with asymmetric capability of air power is probably a future necessity in our war fighting repertoire. But this goes contrarily to our conventional war fighting ethos. So there is a issue here. Something which with this war has led me to sort of dwell on is something which I call pie targeting, political, information, and economic. These are new targeting roles for for force. That means these are the areas which are actually, if they are weapons by themselves, they automatically becomes what should I say, targets in warfare. So this is something which we need to bear in mind, that we have to probably change our approach or add on to the spy targeting. Strategic role of air power, especially its offensive needs, and I can't reiterate more because 71 was a long time ago. 99 in Kargil, we didn't use it. Though we have shown a much more sophisticated approach to understanding of air power today from the days of the 70s. But today it gives a nation a much larger capability beyond the conflict zones of a theater or even a domain, because some targeting issues like leadership, industry, strategic target systems of the adversary nations, these will need clearances at much higher level. And though the army, though the services have their own list, but I'm sure in today's day and age, a lot of them will need closer scrutiny and clearances. So this takes it out of the pure service-specific realms. It goes into a national realm. So we need to look at air power from that perspective as well. And in the end, I just want to summarize by saying that air power's strategic capabilities over and above its joint warfare requirements, which most certainly takes huge amount of precedence, and there's huge amount of lessons you have learned. But it is the strategic capabilities of air power which we need to be recognized and leveraged both in peace and in war, both in national security and interests. I just leave you with two thoughts, which was articulated. I'll come to that later. One is promote a democratic rules-based international order in which nations, small and large, thrive as equal and sovereign. We will work with others to keep our sea, space, and airways free and open. This is one statement, and the next statement is we should have equal access as a right under international law to the use of common spaces on sea and in the air, articulated by none other than the PM in the Shangri-La conference way back in 2018. It's a clear indication, the first time a national leader who has articulated the air dimension. I think it's time for rest of us to spend a little more time thinking and discussing about it, and I'll rest my case with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for that really comprehensive overview of the role of air power in the modern conflict, as well as for India's national security. Now I come to Professor Josna, and ma'am, what are your views on the Ukraine conflict, and how does it affect India's national security? Ma'am, you're on mute. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Yeah, all of us seem to have forgotten this aspect. Very good morning, good evening to all of you. And then thank you, ORF, for inviting me to be here on this panel. Though I was not originally scheduled to be a panelist, but I seem to have been invited to do so now. I will look at it purely from an international relations perspective because experts of other fields are here with their opinions. See, the 1975 Helsinki agreements have frozen the boundaries in Europe. But after the Cold War ended formally, though it never began formally, after 2000, the Russians had taken all this while to grow up in their capabilities, and they are the assertive power now, whether super or not, only time can decide. But then they want to redraw the boundaries. So the old agenda of state formation and boundary creation is going on in Europe once again. It's been the case for the last 600 years, and the Europeans are continuing to do so. And Russia of today is taking advantage of all that is history of the bygone eras. And Ukraine, as all of us are aware, is a resource rich region. The Ukrainian resources are required. It is not just the case of Sevastopol or the submarine repair centers around the coast in Crimea, which they already have occupied some years ago. But then it is the resources and the accessibility and the availability of all those resources that the Russians are looking at. So this business of redrawing boundaries is likely to continue. And I think as far as the implications for India is concerned, I think we must take advantage of this kind of a chaotic situation on the continent of Europe and use it to our advantage in South Asia. I myself would advocate uh, a, 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 a relook at POK post abrogation of 370 in the Indian context. And if the Russians win in Ukraine, the Chinese are going to dare in Taiwan. And of course, General Narasimhan is a better expert on these aspects. But the Taiwanese case and the Ukrainian case will be two issues that India needs to watch very, very closely and with uh, a minuscule perception, because none of the details should be lost on India. Once we repair our economy and bring it to 5 trillion or whatever is the number the leadership wants, we should simultaneously build up our defense capabilities, which we are already doing, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time. And once these issues are taken care of on the home front, the foreign policy and the defense policy must look at the advantages that India will have if we can redraw our boundaries. There is no harm in thinking differently and out of the box. We don't have to shy away from the imposed restrictions on the nation state of 1947. This is my considered opinion on the issue. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Josna, for your thoughts. Now I come to General Narasimhan. And sir, besides your remarks on the Ukraine conflict and its impact on national security, I also wanted to reflect on this question of logistics, which Air Marshal Choudhury mentioned. The fact that the Russians are facing problems on the military logistics front in terms of supplying to their troops who are fighting it out on the ground in Ukraine. How do you look at that particular issue? I mean, I call it as a tyranny of justice and tyranny of distance and logistics.
Uh, Thank you very much, Dr. Samir. My apologies for joining a bit late because I was stuck in another meeting and that took a little more time than what was scheduled. My apologies for the same. I was listening with a lot of interest the comments or the remarks by the three panelists earlier, and there are a number of good points that they brought out with. My own perception of this Russia-Ukraine conflict is something which I would just try to put across in about 5-6 points and then see how I can convey this. One is, the lessons for India, if you look at it, the best lesson that we have got today are two. One, selection of a position in such conflicts and then adhering to that come what may is something that has paid us a very good dividend in this particular operation. So this is something that is a lesson that we can carry home. And I think as long as our logic and our explanation for a particular stand seems to be correct, I think that is being taken on well. I wouldn't say that the entire world is liking us for what we did today, but I think it has been, the practical aspects of this position has been well understood. That is one. Second thing is, I'm sure the people in South Block don't have any doubts on this, but in a conflict like this, if it happens to us, I think we should be prepared to stand alone and fight. You may get additional help in terms of support in the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly, or you may get some assistance in terms of equipment, in terms of information, etc. That is possible. But I think hoping that anybody else would come to help you, I see a lot of analysts talking about quad in a loose manner, that people will come and help you, etc., etc. You need to be extremely careful on that. You need to be prepared to fight your own battle when it comes to it. The other thing is, you need to be preparing adequately to fight. Like, for example, the Russian campaign, which you look at it, and I'll cover the logistics part, which Dr. Samir asked me about. You see, if you look at the principles of war, there are about 13 of them which have been listed. If you go one by one and analyze how the Russians have orchestrated this campaign, I would say that 4 out of 13 is what they have achieved. Reminder, they actually did not adhere to the principles of war. And that is the reason why they are paying the price for what they are doing. And in that, logistics happen to be the major problem in the offensive operations. And if you look at the way the Russians orchestrated this offensive, starting from northwest to entire east to further south, in so many prongs, you will find it will be an extremely difficult offensive operation to persecute. And when you do this kind of an operation, you need to cater for reserves to each of these. When you need to cater for the logistics for each of these, this become a gigantic kind of a problem, which is a logistician's nightmare. And that is what actually Russians are facing at this point in time. The other thing is the information warfare is something that we need to take note of. Today, President Zelensky is the poster boy for everything. In fact, he has been able to sell his narrative so well that each and every parliament around the Western countries have called him for a talk to their parliament, and that has given him a tremendous amount of support, if not a physically in getting involved in the war, but at least a kind of a favorable kind of a view on him, on Ukraine, if not him, and then the support that if the governments want to give, there is a support that has been already there. So this is something, information warfare is something that we need to keep in mind in all our future endeavors, and we need to plan for it. Otherwise, then you will find you may win the war, but you'll lose the narrative. So that is something that we need to take a lesson from here. Air Marshal Choudhury talked about a lot of these manpads and other things. Two more things that we need to keep in mind. I don't know whether Dr. Chawla talked about it because I joined a little later. The role of the drones is something that we need to be keeping in mind. You find this is one weapon system which is gaining more and more importance in warfare. And you find the Turkish drones, which the Ukrainians had, created so much of damage on the tank columns of the Russians. You find that the Russian offensive is generally petering out. So this is one thing of the drones. Second thing is also the handheld anti-tank systems like Javelin, etc. You find this is actually a weapon which can be used in a very potent. You see the pictures in the news when they show it. A guy is having a rifle. He's also carrying a javelin at his back, and then he is trying to interdict a tank. So this kind of a, I would say this is not a structured kind of a conventional war. It is a mix of conventional and unconventional war is what is happening in Ukraine. So this is something which may be the future. That is something that we need to keep in mind. The other thing is the selection of the season, which Air Marshal Choudhury talked about. If probably the Russians had launched this in December, when the snow is hard and the grounds are hard, you find the armored formations would have performed probably much better. Now, when the snow is thawing, the cross-country movement by the tanks is becoming difficult. So you find a large column on the road, which is getting more and more vulnerable for any adversary's attack. So you find the correct season, like you take your mind back to 71, when Sam Manekshaw is expected to have said that I can't launch this offensive now, I need time. Because of the harvest season that is going to take place in the western sector, and also need to prepare my army, and so I'll do it in December. So that is the kind of selection of the season and the time frame that one needs to look at. The other thing that comes into play is the urban warfare. You see, today, after 46th day of war, you find the Russians are not even in control of one major city. Okay, the reason for that is they understand the difficulty of urban warfare, because the moment you get into the city, it is anybody's game. So that takes away all the superiority that you had otherwise, and then make it man to man, and that will become extremely difficult for anybody to win. And each corner can be a bunker, each corner can be some pillbox which can fire at you and then sort you out. So urban warfare is something that we need to be looking at in close domains. The other thing is, I fully agree with Air Marshal Choudhury when he says about joint planning, training, and operations. It is not only adequate to do joint planning. What happens is, it is easy to say you should plan jointly, but there is a mindset that you need to develop to do this joint operations, and that doesn't come when you become seniors. You've already grown in the system for a very long time. So what you need to do is to catch them young. Young officers need to be put through this joint kind of training. joint warfare planning, and then made to execute it jointly. Then you find they grow in their system over a period of time, and then the joint operations will come into play much more effectively. The other thing that has been actually been thrown out of the window in the Russia-Ukraine war is many of the analysts today in the world talk about short, intense wars. Now, the Ukraine war has never been so short, and nor has been so violent. It has been violent, definitely, but not so violent that it finishes within 2 weeks. So now you have to have a rethink on that thinking that you had, that you will fight a short and an intense war. You need to be prepared for a long drawn war, which may or may not be so violent, and then take care of the other issues that you need to do in this entire thing. Dr. Jyotsna talked about China, Taiwan. I would have a little different view on this, ma'am, if you don't mind, please. The reason for that is simple. China, Taiwan is not actually Russia, Ukraine. These are two different things. Russia and Ukraine has got a land border which is easily crossable, and then you can go and do what you want. You have a Taiwan strait to cross, and that is not very easy. Amphibious operations are one of the most difficult operations that anybody can plan and execute. So that is not going to be simple for anybody. And there are many other reasons I can come out with. For want of time, I wouldn't do that. There are many other reasons why Russia, Ukraine should not be compared to China, Taiwan. There are a number of reasons for it. The other thing is, on the closer Sino-Russian ties, is what Dr. Chawla talked about. I have a little different take on this. I get a feeling even the Chinese are actually not very comfortable with what is happening. They have been forced to take a position in some form or the other. I don't think that is very likable by the Chinese also in this particular case, and they just put them in a tight spot. So I don't know whether it will be so clear that Sino-Russian ties will be extremely good and they'll be able to go hand in hand in any other thing. The nuclear weapons was talked about by Dr. Chawla, though I agree with her contention. My understanding of nuclear weapons threat by Russia is actually a sense of desperation. When did he do this? He did it after 2 weeks of war, when he saw that there was no advance being made on ground. So to me, it looks like it is a desperation than of actual usage of nuclear weapons, just to have a threat kind of a being that going. The other thing is about the continental domain and the maritime domain and the air domain, which Air Marshal Choudhury talked about. I think today there is a realization, not only in our armed forces, even in other places. I don't think we are looking at them in silos, like land battle, air battle, and the sea and the maritime battle. I think the time has come to look at them together in terms of a comprehensive security kind of a strategy that will involve all these elements into one, and that is the way to go in future. I'll stop here, and if there are any questions or anything, I'll take it later.
Thank you so much, sir, for raising quite a few important points, especially with regard to jointness, the logistics, as well as the Russia-China relationship. Dr. Chawla, I want to come to you. Taking forward from the Russia-China, I think the other relationship that we want to discuss is Russia-Pakistan. And in fact, at the beginning of the Russian invasion, Prime Minister Imran Khan, now of course former Prime Minister Imran Khan, was in Moscow. So how do you look at that particular relationship evolving in relation to the Ukraine conflict? Ma'am, you're on mute.
Imran Khan's visit to Russia was criticized within Pakistan at the global level. And the relationship that what we saw some time back was, it has been evolving mainly because Pakistan needed friends and support system, and Russia wanted to expand its engagement domain, as I would call it. And there was a kind of an evolving nexus that we would see China, Russia, Pakistan, that was kind of coming up, and we all had apprehensions about it. And during the war, we saw that Pakistan's position, which was not a surprise, and Russia has been issuing statements supporting Imran Khan's narrative on the conspiracy, US conspiracy in the political destabilization of Pakistan. So I think, there, while Russia had been keen to have relationship with Pakistan owing to its interests in Afghanistan, which we saw in the recent time, but two factors will be critical in this relationship from now onwards. One is obviously the economic and the strategic impact of the Ukraine's war on the Russia's economy, that we need to evaluate and see how much Russia can actually offer to Pakistan from Pakistan's point of view. And as it is, Pakistan is not importing any major defense equipment from Russia, and majority of the defense acquisitions are from China. Second part, which I feel is very important, that while Pakistan's will be keen to have relationship with Russia position, but the military certainly within Pakistan is very keen to now revive its ties with United States, which has taken a beating because of Imran Khan's whole narrative about US playing a role in getting him out. So we have seen now Bajwa immediately issuing the statement as an attempt to repair this damage. So how far Pakistan will now go ahead with Russia, given the fact that they want to appease the Americans, this would for the time being constrain the relationship. So in my assessment, this whole relationship will see a status quo for some time, and then after a while we will see that if it has some potential to expand. But right now, for some time to come, I don't see any development in this.
Okay, thank you. Professor Josna, if I can come to you, then how do you look at, for instance, the evolution of the India-Russia relations, given the fact that there is a considerable pressure from the West vis-a-vis our ties with Russia, defense, energy, and all those issues? Ma'am, you're on mute.
Because of the civil population in United States and in North America in general, the usual perception is that America has become very friendly towards India. But then within the armed forces and in the perceptive analyst list, Russia stands number one as India's friend. And today we have reached a stage, despite the 123 agreement, that we are in a position where we can look at our national interests and advocate them publicly, which we have not done earlier. We said non alignment for very many years, and then from there we moved on, and everybody thought we were swinging towards the Americans and then the Russians. But if we have to live within our geography and then expand out of this sphere of India, it has to be with the help of the neighbors, because in the definition of neighborhood we don't have many friends. And in my perception, it is our maritime domain which will be our greatest strength, because in the land and air domains, we are already with contested boundaries and adversaries who are more powerful than us, or apparently so. But in critical terms and in critical times, how do we respond, and with what kind of an integrated force levels and structures and operational capabilities that we come across, fighting a Chinese or fighting the northern neighbors, as both of them are called. But when it comes to diplomatic finesse and articulating national interest, I think the current government and its foreign policy is openly advocating. The very small statement of Mr. Jaishankar in the 2+2 meeting, that what India imports from Russia in terms of energy resources over a month is what Europe is spending in half a day, is a very graphic description of the relations that we have and the world has with Russia. So these fine tuned statements and the articulation and openness with which we are trying to be assertive in our positions from a national interest point of view is something wonderful that is happening in the conflict.
Thank you. Air Marshal Choudhury, if I can come to you. Dr. Chawla, in her initial remarks, talked about the Western criticism or the charge about underperformance of non-performance of the Russian military equipment. You have, flown the frontline aircraft for so many years. How do you look at that particular Western charge in terms of the? I mean, we have the sizable Soviet or Russian equipment still in our military.
Uh, Actually, this question can be looked at from two perspectives. One is from the logistics maintenance aspect of sustaining this platform and the Russian platforms and the fleets and the weapon systems. The other is the issue of employability. Now, when I spoke about the Russian Air Force and the Ukrainian Air Force, it was focused on the employability. Ironically, the present VKS has evolved out of what earlier in 2015, Russia merged its Russian Air Force, the PBO Shani, which was the Air Defense Forces, and the Space Force to form the VKS, Russian Aerospace Forces. So the VVS is the Air Force element of it. Despite doing that, if you see Russia, and this is not just me, you have Colin Scott saying it from the Forbes, you have Larry John C. Johnson, who's a CIA analyst, who's made the statement. In fact, the fact that Russia still uses its air force as a airborne artillery, and those are his words. The bottom line I'm trying to get at is, despite the changes it had made in its outlook of use of air power post Gulf War, and the changes it made in its VKS structure 2015 onwards, but unfortunately, it still remains as an example. It's another nation which has not understood and not leveraged its air power. It looks at air power, like for example, we talk about air superiority. Control of airspace, the larger swath of airspace which impacts surface operations, is still not a part of the Russian of the military strategy. So it requires them to carry out missions for short durations over a certain airspace, and extended artilleries is grads, is missiles, which has been using historically to fill up the firepower space. And so its use of the air was more to support its rapidly moving surface battle. Not very much beyond that. It realized the implications of air defense capability and the need for control of airspaces having seen the Gulf War. But in its doctrines, it still sadly remains, what should I say, underexploited area. So this is the essential issue. Whereas the Ukrainian side they have exercised with the US as well. There's an exercise called Open Skies, I think 2017 or 18, I'm not too sure. When it talked about when it trained with the Western forces. So they've had fair amount of extensive training, but they're limited by the fact that you change your tactics, but your operating platform still remains the same as which the adversary has. And it has obviously the similar vulnerabilities. And this itself becomes an obstruction. That's why, that's what I was mentioning earlier, that you cannot induct other platforms so easily. If they want anything desperately, they would need more Sukhois from countries and MiG-29s, which some of the NATO countries still have. So this is something where it reaches, we will see. But simply put, I think the Russian military VKS, despite its changeover, has still remained legacy in its operational approach and outlook. And this is something we will do well to learn lessons from, because there are certain lessons which on the use of helicopters, airborne forces, close support, the way we look at, and the lack of importance which the Russians gave to their interdiction is a counter lesson which we need to learn. So these are the critical lessons which we need to imbibe in our air power. And surprisingly, this is something which we've had an advantage because our air power have been operating with a whole lot of the Western air forces. So we have a center stage perspective of both sides. And like good Indians, we have found the Indian way out of shortages, and which General Narasimhan knows which the Indian military is exceptional at. So we will always do that. But the fact is, you cannot deny the need for example, he mentioned drones. Now, drones per se will not win you a war, but they are enablers which help speed up the prosecution of warfare. Most certainly, this killer drones or suicide drones, as we call, they always get through. But an ISR drone at a certain in contested airspaces cannot. Drones which have exposed in the air platform for a long time will always remain vulnerable, and especially to manpads. So hence this becomes a challenge. I'm just trying to bring a caution here because I hear in many talks and discussions how drones are today the future of warfare tomorrow. They are will make warfare more efficient, more effective, but like I said, they will not necessarily win you wars.
Thank you so much, General Choudhury, Marshal Choudhury. General Narasimhan, before I wrap up, you mentioned about the information warfare, and from your experience about China and its cyber warfare capabilities, you think what kind of demonstration of the Chinese cyber capabilities might happen in a future or potential conflict with India?
And that's a subject by itself, but let me just give you in a short 30 seconds or 1 minute as to how to do this. See, information warfare actually has got three tenets. One is the cyber, the other one is the psychological operations, and the third one is the electronic warfare. These are the three components of information warfare. What you need to do is a combination of all three. That is one. Second thing is, many people think that it is actually doable during wartime. But my understanding is it is also during normal peacetime you need to do that, and probably you may have to escalate during the wartime. That is the second aspect. Having said this, there are a lot of things which are actually not traceable to the originator. Like for example, cyber warfare. It is extremely difficult to actually pinpoint the originator that this is the computer from which it came, or this is the organization from which it came. And even if you have to do research, it is going to give you results after a much longer time at a later stage. So the thing is that this is a tool that is available to you. You need to make use of it, and Chinese are good at it. Let me tell you this: in either in psychological warfare or in cyber warfare, they are very good at it. And we need to probably draw a lesson from there and get our act together on this. In fact, we have been discussing it in some forums that we need to actually start doing it at a proper level as a strategic communication is something that we need to do. So I think I would say we are still in the starting block, and we will be able to catch up in case we really concentrate on it. I'll leave it at that because there's a little confidential domain which I don't want to open up on this. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we can continue this discussion for a much longer time, but we have to be cognizant of the time at hand also. So thank you to all our stellar panelists, Professor Joskamp, Dr. Chawla, General Simon, and Marshal Choudhury, for joining us today and sharing your really valuable thoughts on the Ukrainian conflict and what it means for India. It's been an
I
absolute
thank
pleasure to
ORF
moderate
and
this
Dr.
discussion.
Samir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very
Samir.
much for
Thank you very
inviting
much.
us.
Thank you, Dr. Patel.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining.